From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. Protests are in the streets, calls to defund police, marches to support the Black Lives Matter movement. Renters and landlords are squaring off over eviction bans. There are a lot of reasons Canadians feel compelled to make their voices heard right now.
Tenants can no longer wait. It has been months that everyone knows what's coming and no one is doing anything about it.
The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms grants every Canadian the legal rights to freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly. But depending on the nature of the protest, there can still be legal consequences. Many Canadians who have never protested before are hitting the streets in 2020. So consider this a need-to-know guide on what your legal rights are during a protest. What should you know before going to protest? What could it mean for your job and to your employer if you do go? Today, we're talking to Toronto Star reporter Angelyn Francis. She often covers stories about inequality and inequity. She spoke to two employment lawyers for a piece she wrote in the Star about your legal rights during and after a protest. Hey, Angelyn, nice to talk to you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Adrian.
You've covered and witnessed many of the protests happening this year. As a reporter, when you saw that, what kinds of questions were you asking yourself?
Well, I think the thing that struck me a lot about this time around, when there's been a big wave of people talking about Black Lives Matter and police-involved murders and things like that, there was just a bigger volume of people, like everyday people who maybe weren't super politically engaged. It just seemed like a much wider sweep of people trying to get involved and talking about things. So it just made me think that there may be a lot of people who this is very brand new for, and maybe launching them a little bit out of their comfort zone. So I guess I was starting to think about what questions they may have.
And one of those questions, of course, that a protester might have is what legal rights they have, especially if they are arrested by police. What did you find out? You spoke to two employment lawyers for their counsel and their knowledge on this. What should anyone know if they go to a protest?
Well, a few of the things that the two lawyers I spoke to pointed out, you don't necessarily have to disclose that you're arrested in the first place. That was one of the questions that I had right away, because I sort of was wondering, well, how would somebody necessarily know? And there are some jobs, for example, if you work with vulnerable populations, if you work for a daycare, if you work at a place where a background check was a requirement for the job in the first place, there may be something in your contract for sure that outlines that you have an ongoing obligation to disclose if you have any sort of interaction with police. But if you are arrested, maybe not even charged, if you're just detained for a little bit, that doesn't necessarily have to be something that you necessarily share with your employer. And then the other element of it too is for there to be a reason for your employer to terminate you based on something that you're doing outside of work, it comes down to what kind of impact it's going to have on their image and their ability to do business. So are people going to have a negative perception of this place that you work now based on the fact that you were at a protest and potentially got arrested? Is it going to impact their ability to do business? It also matters if you're unionized or if you're non-unionized, because if you're unionized, then an employer has to actually come with just cause, and they have to come and say that, yes, this actually did have some kind of negative impact on us. This was a problem with the contract that we had together. So I have the reason to let you go.
And that's actually something that I really wanted to get into, because when you talk about unionized versus non-unionized, there's obviously a big difference when it comes to job security in how just cause is used. And I find that interesting because many protesters that we've seen on the streets, they're young people. There are people in their 20s, their 30s, their early 40s. And we know that job precarity is a huge thing that millennials are facing already. Is the deck sort of stacked against protesters then, especially if for young people who want to speak out on this and facing job precarity?
Yeah, that is a really good point too, one that I hadn't even considered necessarily. There are so many young people who are doing short-term contracts, who are temporary who are serving or work in the service industry, so they don't have the same kind of job protection as somebody who is unionized or has been at their job for years and years and years. I think what comes along with that, though, is that young people are in one way a little bit more at risk in terms of their job. They may have a little bit of less security with their job, but they also may have less to lose also. They may also be thinking that, oh, this contract was only for 3 months. I'm supposed to be up in a few months anyway. And it may actually mean that they have a little bit less tie and less worry to their employers.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Is there a distinct difference between attending a protest versus being arrested and possibly charged? I'm assuming that an employer will see those two things pretty differently. At least an employment lawyer would see it pretty differently.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The two lawyers that I talked to, Fatima Kader and Mika Imai, both of them actually brought up the fact that it does come down to how big of an impact it has on your boss and on their ability to do business. So if you are arrested, that definitely has a little bit more of a negative connotation than if you're simply attending and not much happens. But at the same time, you never really know if simply attending a protest may be something that's kind of out of sync with what your boss has envisioned for their company. Although right now it seems like a whole lot of like more mainstream businesses, like from McDonald's to Starbucks to the NFL, have been more vocally supporting anti-Black racism and movements against those. So the conversation is shifting for sure.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, in reading your piece, it's that one of the just causes that an employer can use to terminate your contract or to terminate your employment is that you've damaged their reputation. And even that word, reputation, it's changing. The goalposts are moving in how workplaces and how businesses are viewing the Black Lives Matter movement and certainly a push for racial equality. Mm-hmm. How do you think that notion of reputation, even that idea, how does that play into all of this?
Yeah, for sure. I never thought I would see it, to be honest. It's a little bit surprising for me to see that this moment is really so similar to what happened when Black Lives Matter first started a few years ago. There's been a series of people who've been killed by police. There's been a series of protests. There's been a lot of talk online. But initially when it started, I didn't see any big companies really coming out with public statements the same way they have been right now. So it seems like they've kind of changed their PR strategy and kind of awoken to the fact that this isn't a super radical statement to make, just saying that Black Lives Matter.
And you could go one step further where if a business fired somebody because they supported the BLM movement, in turn, their reputation of that business might actually be worse because they fired somebody, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. Even like more locally. So I guess it was a month ago or so, somebody had sent me this email that they got that was circulated at their job. They worked for this payday lending company and said that they got an email from their CEO explicitly saying, do not support Black Lives Matter. This is an uninclusive movement and more things to that effect. We actually wound up covering a story like some other reporters in our radio room at the Star covered the story, and the CEO wound up resigning after he circulated that letter. So it kind of shows that whatever kind of backlash he got, whether it was internal from staff or from the public, I'm not too sure, but he wound up stepping down because it seems kind of out of sync with where people are at this moment.
Even this idea that this push for racial equality and people calling for that, that is not, for many businesses and society at large, that's not a radical idea. That is a moral imperative for a lot of people. And that's what's driving a lot of people out into the streets.
Oh, yeah. It's not bad press anymore. I'm really curious about what the chicken or the egg is for that. I wonder what the impetus for that has been, whether it's because so many people have been vocally speaking about this since May, or is it that corporations just kind of collectively woke up, like maybe you knock once and they didn't really answer, and then you knock twice and something's finally getting through. But it could be just because so many people have been speaking out about it collectively that they're trying to stay in tune with the direction society's moving.
Did the employment lawyers tell you anything about how these cases are playing out in the real world for them and clients that they're taking on? Is the ground of how the law is applied, is it changing for them too?
That didn't actually come up, but that would be an interesting discussion. I can think of like the recent case, like one sort of real life comparison one of them made was what even is grounds for an arrest. So the example being most recently, like Black Lives Matter did a bit of a protest where they threw paint on some of these controversial historical figures. They threw some washable pink paint on Egerton Ryerson and John A. MacDonald and a couple others around the city. And 3 people wound up being arrested by police for vandalism.
Why are we celebrating him? Why was that statue, pink paint on that statue, more important than the lives of Black queer women, of mad queer women, of activists?
And what one of the employment lawyers I spoke to mentioned that I completely forgot, and I should really remember because I did go to Ryerson, but it's really common practice during Frosh Week. Engineering students usually dye themselves purple as part of the activities and festivities, and they climb all over the Egerton Ryerson statue and get paint on it, and sometimes pull little pranks. And maybe like there are a lot of pranks involving the statue, and the reaction isn't the same. Both of them involve paint being thrown on the statue or the statue being covered in washable paint, but the reaction was very different. I haven't heard of anybody getting arrested because of these Frosh Week activities.
Right, exactly. And it's almost because, again, the group that was involved was Black Lives Matter Toronto. And of course, the arrests following that also were pretty controversial in terms of what they were being charged with, as I understand it.
Exactly, yeah. And then I think in terms of people were calling the police station demanding that they be released. So it's like their switchboard, I guess, was ringing off the hook. So a statement was put out saying they've been released, but then people who knew them personally said, no, they haven't been. I have not heard a word from them. Their lawyers haven't seen them. There was a lot of back and forth in terms of what the police were announcing publicly and then what people were saying was actually happening.
So is there a handy guide at the end of this that people can remember if they go to a protest, what they should know in terms of how they should tell their employers if they have been involved? Is there a clear-cut idea of what protesters should know in relation when they go there, if they get arrested, or even by attending? Is there something that people can remember and take home on how they should tell their employers about it?
I think it's different depending on the scenario. I think it's totally different depending on the scenario. I think what you should consider before you go is what your level of comfort would be. I think that may be the easiest conversation to have with yourself. So you know when you think things have maybe escalated too far and you want to remove yourself, so that you know if you're okay with having your photo taken, or if you maybe want to wear sunglasses or a mask or something as a means to kind of help give yourself a bit of anonymity. I think those are the conversations that are the easiest to have and to start with yourself so that you have an idea of what you're getting yourself into when you go out. And then from there, I think it's just a matter of keeping in mind what conversations you may have heard at your workplace. If you have an idea if your boss may be supporting this as well, you probably have less to worry about than if you may have heard different remarks or experienced different things at your workplace. It's totally tailored to each person, but I think it's just a matter of taking these things into account and deciding for yourself if that's the way that you want to support the movement, because there are absolutely different ways that people can support.
Right. So there's a lot of gray area here. It depends on your job security. It depends on where you work. It depends on whether you're attending or whether you got arrested. There is no clear case here of what you should know and what you should do.
Yeah, it's totally a little tricky for sure. Even talking to lawyers about it too, they definitely reiterate that it is always on a case-by-case basis. But those are some things to for sure keep in mind and to continue speaking up in a way that's most comfortable for you.
Angelyn, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Thanks for having me.
That's Angelyn Francis, Toronto Star reporter who often covers inequity and inequality. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.